Today we're going to be talking about, what are we talking about? We're talking about best practices in evaluation of grid modernization. So thanks very much for joining us. Good morning, Vice Chair Hall. Nice to see you this morning. So we wanted to start with a moment of silence. The New Mexico PRC suffered a pretty big loss over the weekend. Isaac Sullivan Leshin passed away. And so we thought we would start with a moment of silence. GridWorks has not had an opportunity to work with Isaac for very long, but we found him incredibly effective and a really kind soul. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera for just a minute and we'll observe a moment of silence. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate that. So welcome again to the 8th webinar in the grid modernization series at the New Mexico PRC. We're going to tell you what our objectives are, as we do every time. We are going to present different methodologies and evaluations for looking at utility grid investments, and then we seek to get your input about which ones of these may work, are working, and the goal is to help inform staff that's going to be putting together a NOPR on grid modernization. So Deb, next slide. So our agenda, I'm going to review the minutes quickly that we did from the last meeting on transportation electrification. Then we're going to go into our presentation. We're going to have clarifying questions for a while. And then we are going to go into our facilitated discussion as we do every time, and then we will do our wrap up. And exciting news for you all, on the 16th, we had a webinar scheduled that we were going to talk about best practices from other states, and we decided that that was not necessary. So we're going to give you back an hour and a half of your time on the 16th, which I think everybody always appreciates. So in the meeting last month, May 19th, we talked about transportation electrification and some of the key themes that came out. And the presenter was Trina Horner from Key Valley. She was really excellent, and I think presented the level of information that was necessary. We know New Mexico is growing last year at 164% electric vehicle growth over the previous year. And we know that electric vehicle growth will not follow a traditional path, that it may be very hockey stick-like. EVs are different in that they can provide a supply side resource, and they're also a demand side resource, and that they move. And so that makes them very different from a planning perspective. When utilities are thinking about how to plan for EVs, the suggestion was that using scenarios makes a lot of sense, and there's many variables that should be considered in that scenarios: where the vehicles will be charged, when the vehicles will be charged, how long they'll be charged, and how many vehicles there might be. We also talked about that knowing who the EV adopters may be and how that might change over time is going to be useful information. And then ultimately, what's the aggregated impact on the grid from having, thousands or millions of vehicles charging on the grid? We also talked about that planning needs to be flexible on behalf of the utilities, that knowing what municipal or private fleet goals are would help in doing planning. We recognize that ownership of charging station has been an issue that the state of New Mexico has not grappled with, and I know that can be a pretty tricky issue in some states. And then EVs will increase electricity use, but using rate design and incentive can manage when and where vehicles are charged, and that if it's done well, it can really push electric vehicle charging to off-peak, which can provide system and cost benefits. We also acknowledge that there's a number of overlaps with EVs policy in the grid modernization rule, if it ends up in there, related to other rules around electrification of transportation and transportation planning rules. And then we also talked about how in the beginning of our webinar series, we talked about some of the fundamentals of grid modernization like AMI, and how AMI and other technologies will really help utilities gather the information that they need to know what's on their system and also plan for the future. We also discussed that the utilities have done outreach to fleets and individuals around EV planning, but there's much more to do, and that the utilities have created initial transportation electrification plans, but those are early plans, and that certainly there will be a lot of learning going on as we go forward. And someone noted rightly that EV planning takes time, and the time to really dig in to EVs, because we expect such explosive growth, is to do it now. So that's what we covered last time on our webinar. And Deborah has put the notes in the chat. And if you need them in the future, you can always look at the GridWorks website. We capture every meeting and we post the agenda, the slides, the notes. So they're always there for you to go reference. Okay, so I'm very happy to move on to today's topic. We're going to talk about evaluation methods for grid investments and distributed energy resources. We have John Cheneau here from the Regulatory Assistance Project. Very happy to have worked with John for a number of years, so I know how capable he is. John has a history working with RAP and others, advising utility commissions and regulatory agencies on public policy best practices. He was an advisor to the PSC in Wisconsin for many years, and also worked at the Natural Resources Department in Wisconsin as an air pollution regulator and an electric utility specialist. And John lives in beautiful Fort Collins, Colorado. So we are very happy to have him with us today. Deb, if you want to move on and move to, there's John on the screen and in picture. So if you want to move on and give John the capability to go to his slides, I think we can jump right into the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Amanda, for that introduction. Thank you all for inviting me to present today. Before I get started, is my sound quality okay?
It's good. Thank you, John.
Great, great. Well, today I've been asked to talk to you about evaluation methods for grid investments and DERs. How do we decide whether or not to make certain types of investments? And I'm going to start with a quick comparison of the two most common evaluation methods. I'm going to compare least cost methods, which are typically used to make utility investment decisions, with benefit cost analysis, or BCA methods. Forgive me for using the BCA acronym throughout this presentation. After I do that compare and contrast, I'll look at three different types of regulatory proceedings where BCA is sometimes used and offer examples from other states. So let's get started with that comparison of the two most common evaluation methods. Utilities have traditionally used least cost methods when making decisions about long-term investments, right? They first identify grid requirements that are projected, and then they look at the least costly way to satisfy those requirements. And that can be based on cost estimates, computer modeling, or actual cost data coming from bids or a competitive procurement process. Because modifications are sometimes made to what is strictly or technically the least cost solution, and that might be done, for example, to achieve secondary priorities or to account for some of the risks in forecasting future costs. I prefer using the term least cost best fit to describe this approach. You might see LCBF in my slides. But again, it's usually the same as a least cost approach. It's just sometimes the results are tweaked a little because something that isn't strictly least cost is considered the best solution. The basic approach used in BCA is different. So here we estimate the lifetime cost of a potential action in present day dollars. And then we estimate the lifetime benefits and compare the two. And then, of course, if the benefits exceed the costs, we say the action is expected to be cost effective. The trick with this simple formula is that sometimes something that is a benefit to one party is a cost to another. If the utility offers a customer an energy efficiency incentive, it's a cost to the utility, it's a benefit to the customer. So to figure out if an action is cost effective, we have to first agree on the perspective from which we're going to evaluate costs and benefits. And there are 5 BCA tests that have traditionally been used to evaluate distributed energy resources, plus a 6th test that puts a new twist on the traditional ones. And they're all shown in this table. I'm not going to go through every cell of the table, I promise. Each test evaluates benefits and costs from a different perspective. They answer different questions. Almost all states use one of the first 4 tests in this table as their primary test for making decisions about distributed energy resource programs. The utility cost test in the first row, that one tells us if the utility's total cost of service, in other words, its revenue requirement, will go up or down as a result of the program. The total resource cost test, which is in the second row, takes a look at the combined costs and the combined benefits for the utility and program participants, because most of the time, customers are putting some of their own money into the DER investment. A societal cost test in the third row looks at all of the costs and all of the benefits that accrue to everyone in society. And then the fourth row shows the new twist on the traditional tests. Some states are creating their own unique jurisdiction-specific tests that looks at cost effectiveness in meeting utility needs while simultaneously achieving policy goals. This map shows you which test each state uses as their primary test for making decisions about energy efficiency programs, which are, of course, the most widespread DER programs. The total resource cost test, shown in green, is the most common primary test. New Mexico and several other states, shown in blue, use the utility cost test, which is the second most common primary test. And then a small but growing number of states, shown in pink, have created their own jurisdiction-specific test. So I said I did the contrast. Also, there are some really important differences between least cost methods and benefit cost analysis methods. LCBF doesn't require any estimate of benefits. It's just about costs. but BCA looks at both. LCBF is a tool for minimizing costs, while BCA gives you insights on how to maximize net benefits. And by net, I mean benefits minus costs. LCBF generally starts with an investment that is presumed to be needed, and then you find the least cost solution. BCA can actually tell you whether the benefits of an investment will be greater than the costs before you've taken that step of presuming that it is needed. On the downside, BCA is more complex because you're evaluating costs and benefits. But without question, both tools are useful. Here's the point, and here's the main point though. You might make different investment decisions if your goal is to maximize net benefits than you will if your goal is to minimize costs. And the fact that these two approaches can yield different answers is the main reason why I'm seeing so many commissions using BCA methods in more and more types of regulatory proceedings. And they're doing that especially in proceedings where the investment that they're evaluating, they might not be needed to keep the lights on per se, but they're desired because they offer new benefits to customers. So you want to use a tool to evaluate those benefits. And that's why the rest of my presentation is going to focus on examples of those types of proceedings where BCA is increasingly being used. I'm going to show you tables and charts. I'm not going to walk you through all the numbers because the numbers aren't the point today. The point is to show you that BCA is being used to make lots of regulatory decisions where maybe traditionally it wasn't. And I provide links for each example so you can go to source documents if you want those kinds of details. The first type of proceeding I want to look at is the one where BCA is most commonly used, and that's to evaluate DER programs that are offered by utilities to their customers. I'll start with an energy efficiency example from Wisconsin. Even though I realize that New Mexico has plenty of experience evaluating its own efficiency programs, I'm only going to give you examples from other states today. The evaluation shown here was the first one in the history of Wisconsin's efficiency programs where transmission and distribution system benefits of energy efficiency were estimated. And that's why at the bottom of the table, they show the evaluation results with and without T&D benefits. They did that so you could compare it to evaluations from prior years. Those benefits turned out to be really significant. About 8% of the total benefits were from avoided T&D costs. I chose this example today because it underscores the importance of accounting for all of the relevant impacts of your DER programs, all of the relevant costs and all of the relevant benefits. In this example, you could argue that in prior years, Wisconsin was ignoring 8% of the benefits of their energy efficiency programs, and that might have affected investment decisions. The next example I have for you is of a customer program, comes from Oregon. In this case, a utility requested approval to offer rebates for residential electric vehicle charging stations and also to create a demand response program using those chargers. This example, I think, shows interesting results. As you can see that in the bottom row, the EV charging station rebates were not cost effective. The benefit cost ratio was less than 1. On the other hand, the demand response program that was enabled by the chargers was cost effective. But the two program components in combination were still not cost effective. And I chose this example today because it shows you why you might want to look at packages of related investments for their total impacts, rather than just reviewing each grid mod or DER investment in isolation. Another thing that's interesting in this example is that the utility used the rate impact measure test. That's what the RIM in the title means. Even though that is not the test Oregon regulators normally use to screen DER programs. And that leads to a common weakness in BCA practices. In my work around the country, I see a lot of inconsistency in the approaches taken for different DERs. States and utilities often use one cost test to evaluate energy efficiency and a different cost test to evaluate distributed generation or demand response or storage, as the Oregon utility did in my previous example. They may also apply the test differently. For example, let's say counting avoided carbon benefits for one type of DER, but not for another. Or they might use a different discount rate for future year benefits in one BCA compared to another. And this can lead to serious problems. I really want to stress this. If you don't treat all resources equally, it's pretty simple. You may invest too much for one kind and too little for another. So adopting a more consistent approach to BCA can help you achieve the lowest system costs. That's why several states, including Maryland and Washington State quite recently, have opened proceedings to establish a consistent approach to BCA across all resource types. So how should you decide which tests to use? On this question, I'm going to highly recommend a publication called the National Standard Practice Manual for Benefit Cost Analysis of Distributed Energy Resources. That's a mouthful, so we just call it the NSPM. It was written by industry experts a few years ago. They came from multiple organizations, and they accepted input from a multi-stakeholder advisory group. The NSPM offers a set of high-level principles shown on this slide that regulators can use to guide their decisions about which cost test to use. The NSPM also suggests a process you could follow if you wanted to develop a jurisdiction-specific test for New Mexico. So I'm happy to take questions about that, but I'm not going to go into each of these principles individually. I just highly recommend that you look at the NSPM. The second type of proceeding which we find examples of BCA is when utilities seek pre-approval of grid modernization investments. In this example from Arkansas, the utility Entergy sought approval to replace analog meters across its service territory with advanced metering infrastructure, AMI. Entergy filed this BCA with its application for pre-approval, basically to support their claim that AMI was in the public interest. And what I really like about this example is that it shows the expected operational benefits of smart metering, of smart meters, separate from some of the benefits that might be considered more speculative, like peak capacity cost reductions. And what's good about that is that some of the potential benefits of AMI don't happen just because you install the meters. The meters unlock the potential for things like time of use rates or new demand response programs that can have huge benefits, but only if the utility implements those options. So when I look at this Arkansas example, I'm thinking that if a utility presents a BCA like this one, where they're claiming that there will be peak capacity cost reductions, I'd want to ask if they are committed to implementing the programs that turn that potential into reality, right? So moving on, I also found this report from NEEP that summarized evaluation results, BCA results for AMI deployments at 8 different utilities in 6 different Northeast states. And I wanted to share that because each case study is a little bit different. And now you have lots of examples to work from. All right, next example. In Maryland, the investor-owned utilities filed applications to initiate 8 energy storage pilots, and they did that to comply with the state law. In this example, the PSC staff, the commission staff, conducted a BCA of the proposed projects under different sets of assumptions, and they found that some of the projects would be cost-effective and some not. The utilities didn't do the BCA, the commission staff did. And that's why I chose this example. It's a reminder that we don't have to just hope or expect that a utility itself will do a BCA when they're proposing a grid mod investment. The commission can request one. The commission can order one. Or in some cases, it might even be possible for other parties to a case to do a BCA analysis on their own. The next example comes from 2020 when Xcel Energy in Colorado asked commission approval for a transportation electrification plan. Xcel commissioned its own BCA that looked at the net benefits of expected electric vehicle deployment in Colorado through 2030. And they looked at it under various scenarios that involved different actions, different investments by the utility. And I chose this example for 2 reasons. First, Xcel reported BCA results using 3 different cost tests. And that's nice because it provides information from 3 different perspectives. Second, I chose this example because these results show EV investment scenarios, most of which are cost effective, unlike the Oregon EV plan that we just looked at earlier. And the reason I wanted to do that is to make the point that you can't look at a BCA from one utility that says a specific type of grid mod investment will or won't be cost effective and assume the same will be true for all utilities. The local circumstances and details matter tremendously. Now, I've shown you some examples where BCA was used to evaluate grid mod investments. But most of the time, these kind of decisions are actually being made, they're still being made using a least cost best fit approach. So how do you decide which tool to use? The U.S. Department of Energy recently published a grid mod implementation guide, which I recommend. And that guidebook recommends the use of BCA methods only for grid expenditures that are incremental to the core utility expenditures that are necessary for safety, necessary for reliability, or necessary to integrate DERs. Then when there is the potential for supplemental benefits beyond those core investments, that's when they recommend benefit cost analysis. And here's an example of how the approach suggested in the DOE guidebook played out in one state. When the utilities in Hawaii proposed a comprehensive grid mod strategy in 2017, they proposed to use least cost best fit methods for any investments necessary to satisfy service quality, safety, and state policy requirements, and said they would only use BCA to evaluate investments that were surplus to those core requirements. And here's an example of what that looked like. In 2019, the Hawaii utilities filed for approval of an advanced distribution management system, ADMS. Their application quantified all of the costs, but it only provided qualitative information about benefits. And the utilities explain this with the quote you have on the screen here. And bear with me, I really, it's important, so I want to read it. The utility said that it is impracticable to aggregate implementation benefits for use in a traditional benefit cost analysis. The investments are foundational to and enable other programs. They have interrelated and naturally synergistic functions that make it infeasible to determine the cost effectiveness of each component independently. And I want you to know I've seen similar reasoning to this show up in PUC cases in California and in Michigan. So I think New Mexico stakeholders will also need to think about when and when not to use BCA. But before I move on, I want to offer my opinion. I think the DOE guidebook recommendations are a little bit too narrow. States that follow them to the letter, I think, could miss out on opportunities to increase net benefits. And they may end up making grid mod investments that cost more than they're worth because somebody presumed that they were necessary. All the talk in this quote here about interrelated and synergistic functions can potentially be addressed by looking at packages of investments rather than looking at each individual component of it independently, which is the part they say is infeasible. Okay, the third and last type of proceeding I want to look at is where BCA is used in long-term planning dockets. This slide, which I borrowed from a national task force on comprehensive electricity planning, shows the basic building blocks for any type of utility process, be it integrated resource planning, transmission planning, or distribution system planning. Oops, there you go. The arrows indicate several steps in the planning process where I think BCA methods could be used to improve planning outcomes. But I'm going to focus just on the two arrows that are filled in. The first big opportunity for using BCA is in the load forecasting step. And the second, even bigger opportunity comes when you're exploring options for addressing future grid needs, and specifically looking at non-wires alternatives. So let's look at examples of each of those. Pacificor is a utility that operates in 6 Western states. In its most recent IRPs, the utility has used supply curves to figure out how much demand response potential it could put under contract at different price points. The first line in the table shows how much, shows the amount of demand response that would be cost effective at a price of less than $10 per megawatt hour. But if the utility is willing to pay more than that, there's more demand response potential out there. Customers will respond to prices. So each line below the first shows how much additional demand response potential Pacificor thought would be cost effective in each state at higher price increments. And what's neat about this is instead of guessing how much demand response they could put under contract 5 or 10 years into the future, and then just using that number to modify their load forecast, Pacificor puts this supply curve data into the planning model. And based on the projections of future energy costs, it lets the model figure out the cost-effective amount of demand response to procure and to include in the preferred resource portfolio. So the last example I have for you is from New York, and it's a non-wires example. This graphic summarizes how non-wires alternatives are integrated into the distribution system planning process for two affiliated New York utilities. In the first column, they use fairly traditional methods to determine the types of infrastructure they might need to build within the planning time horizon. Then they apply screening criteria, and they use the screening criteria to decide which of the likely infrastructure investments might be suitable for consideration of non-wires alternatives. In the second column, in orange, they scope out the DER performance attributes that would be needed to effectively substitute for each needed infrastructure investment that passed the screen. In the third column, they develop a plan for how they'll solicit DER proposals. And then in the fourth column, they evaluate the bids they receive. Top-ranked proposals from DER providers are compiled to develop multiple portfolios of DERs that could fulfill the non-wires project need. And then the utility conducts a benefit cost analysis on these multiple portfolios in order to determine the optimal portfolio. If one of those DER portfolios is cost effective compared to the infrastructure solution, then they move in the fifth column into the final stage where they procure, construct, and operate the non-wires alternative. So I know I've run long. I better wrap up. I do want to offer you a few key takeaways, though. First, a reminder: BCAs yield different answers than least cost modeling because they evaluate cost and benefits. BCAs are commonly used to evaluate utility programs offered to customers, especially energy efficiency programs. They're increasingly being used to evaluate utility grid mod investments, but they may not be the best tool in all cases. There is still, and probably always will still be, a place for least cost methods, which in some ways are simpler. And BCA techniques can supplement least cost methods in a planning process or be integrated into the process. I'll just end by suggesting that you try to answer three crucial questions about how New Mexico ought to evaluate potential utility investments. First, when will you use BCA methods instead of or in addition to least cost methods? And my suggestion there is that you consider this whenever you really want to maximize net benefits and not only minimize costs. Second, what cost test will you use? And here I recommend getting familiar with the NSPM document. And then third, how will you use the BCA results? How will they factor into decision making? Will they be the determining factor in some decisions, or will they just be used to supplement other information? There are links throughout my slides to the examples I gave, but here are some bigger picture resources that I recommend for your consideration. They include the NSPM, a new affiliated NSPM document on methods, tools, and resources, one specifically for benefit cost analysis of grid mod investments, and then the DOE guidebook that I mentioned. Here's my contact information. I thank you for your time and attention, and I welcome clarifying questions.
John, excellent. Thank you so much. And as everybody knows, All the presentations are already loaded on the GridWorks website. And I especially appreciated that throughout the presentation, you do have those links, so it's pretty easy to find. So we had a couple comments in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and let people ask those questions because we don't have that many. So Art, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? And I think we can take down the slides too, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you, John, for a thorough presentation. And I guess that we're struggling with the variability to quantify benefits for some of these investments. And you alluded to it in the Hawaii situation. And I'll just use an example. You can have an AMI system that is mostly to replace physical meter reading and do a cost benefit analysis on that. But if you want this AMI system to provide you with a lot of insight into usage flows in the jurisdiction, or achieve some of the other benefits in terms of system transparency and kind of reducing the time to restore service, you need big software systems that do not in and of themselves have a monetized benefit, right? Can you talk about those challenges and what you might suggest? Because that's exactly what we're going to be facing here, is that a lot of the investments, as you say, are enabling investments. How do we even quantify those benefits?
Thanks for the question. That is a great question. It's perhaps the most important question on this topic. And I just, by way of starting to answer that, I want to clarify that if I felt like the DOE guidebook is too narrow and that the Hawaii example might be one where they had alternatives that I think would have been preferable to just talking qualitatively about benefits. I want to be clear that I recognize that challenge you describe, Arthur. I recognize that it is difficult, sometimes impossible, to quantify those benefits in a way that you can defend in a contested case or even just a proposal. I say that because there will be cases, there will continue to be cases where you have to make a judgment call about whether a specific grid mod investment is needed to have the grid that you want in New Mexico, and then you find the least cost solution using least cost methods without going through the rigor of a benefit cost analysis. That will happen. What I would say is that there are examples where benefits are a little more easily quantifiable. I tried to give you an example from the Arkansas proceeding, right? So what I would say there is that a utility can use a whole host of studies that are out there that says, if we were to implement a demand response program, we think we can shave peaks by this many megawatts. And they can usually estimate the avoided costs from doing that. And if they are implementing that through some sort of automated program that makes use of AMI or some other grid mod investment, they might be able to quantify those benefits. But if the grid mod investment is like the telecommunications backbone for your distribution system, good luck. I wouldn't even know how to do that. And it's one where you're almost certainly going to end up using least cost methods. I don't know if that fully addressed your question, Arthur, but I do sympathize. I'm not suggesting in any way that you try to do a benefit cost analysis of everything. You shouldn't and you couldn't.
Yeah, thanks, John. Let's go to Pat.
Thanks, and thanks, John, for great presentation. I was just looking at it and kind of went to the next question when I saw, all the examples were presented with kind of a point estimate of an NPV. We tend to get to that in our regulatory cases just because it's easier. But on both the cost side, like the example Arthur gave, and benefit side, you might end up with, it's not really a point estimate, it's a range based on uncertainty of future, especially like if energy cost is a big piece of it. How often does that play into this? Is one method stronger than the other for dealing with the fact that we live in an uncertain world?
Yeah, so much as you would in an IRP process, you could evaluate different scenarios or sensitivities in a benefit cost analysis. That is often done when people are doing potential studies for distributed energy resources. And it's probably embedded in some of the examples I gave you, where there are, first of all, some of, at least one or two of the examples I gave you looked at multiple scenarios. But more importantly, I was trying to give you a visual that summarized the results from different reports and studies and filings in other states. Quite often what you'll see is that I excerpted the baseline analysis of benefits and costs. And in some cases, if you go to the source documents, you'll find that there are ranges of estimates. I hope that addresses your question, Pat. It is not that hard. Once you've sort of created the structure and reached agreement on what you will and will not count in your BCA, it's not that hard to plug in ranges and see how they play out in the end results. I'll just mention, there are also examples where the results are so clear that that's probably why they didn't present ranges, where if something is clearly not cost effective or clearly cost effective, we often decide it's not worth it to do some of that sensitivity analysis.
So I'm going to read a question from Tayoko, and then I'll go to Vice Chair Hall and then to Brian. So Tayoko asks, when you think about a BCA test, do you think that's more of a multi-stakeholder test, while least cost is really more a traditional test done by utilities?
So if Tayoko's question is about who is doing the analysis or who is,
I think it's how involved is least cost really just the utilities do the numbers, but when you have to prove benefits, that maybe more stakeholders can be involved. And Tayoko, if I mischaracterize that, you can clarify.
I don't really see much of a difference between the two. You're probably used to having stakeholder engagement in your IRP processes, and that stakeholders often have a chance to share data and opinions about inputs to an IRP, and the same can be said for benefit cost analysis.
Okay, great. Vice Chair Hall. And then I also wanted to recognize that Commissioner Maestas is also with us today.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up a little more on the question Arthur asked about, what if you could discuss the challenges of actually quantifying benefits. And I understand it can be difficult. I just wondered if you were aware of any states where the commissions had kind of gotten into that position where they just had to make a call, a judgment call, as you said, or also, if you were aware of states that seem to be able to succeed in serially applying this methodology, or maybe concurrently applying the methodologies to get to a result. I realize, this hasn't been worked on for very long, but I just wondered if you could point me to some states that may have some expertise.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yeah.
I can. So I gave you the example from Hawaii in the slides. I won't repeat that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I said that California had adopted a similar approach to Hawaii, with this idea of trying to figure out things that they considered core grid mod investments and using least cost methods for those. But probably the example that I find most interesting comes from Michigan. Some of the grid mod investments that have already been approved followed basically that same pattern. Is the Michigan utilities explaining that it was not feasible for them to evaluate the benefits of each component of what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
So they described benefits qualitatively. They were more or less imitating what they'd seen in California and Hawaii, what they'd seen utilities do in California and Hawaii. But the interesting part was that this approach became a real topic of discussion in Michigan in a proceeding that's looking at integrating planning processes.
Mm-hmm.
And that integrated planning process kind of overlaps with some of the grid mod discussions in Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
But what has happened there is there's a really robust conversation led by staff, no commission decision as yet, but exploring whether the commission will want to use benefit cost analysis in more types of decisions. And so there's already staff questions that have been posed to parties in that proceeding and comments that have been filed. But there isn't an order today from the Michigan Commission that sort of establishes in a formal way how they will use benefit cost analysis versus least cost methods. I would just say that there's a record being developed there and a pretty robust discussion of when each tool might be suitable.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Thanks, John. Brian, last clarifying question.
Oh man, okay. Last question. That makes me more important. So what I've gathered from the presentation and listening to some of the other questions, particularly related to the complexity of measuring the benefits and probably the complexity of measuring the cost too, frankly, because there's a lot of ways you can look at it. It seems like when you're doing a benefit cost analysis, there is an almost limitless number of assumptions you can do, particularly when it's very like we said, these investments are foundational, right? And they can lead to a whole universe of possibilities into the future. At what point does that sort of dilute the value of benefit cost analysis for something like grid mod? Because it can simply turn into an exercise of arguing assumptions to end up with the position that you want anyway, right? So for other reasons, I guess just the vastness of it, does that hurt the value of benefit cost analysis for something like grid mod?
Well, what I would say is that there clearly are trade-offs and considerations in deciding which tool to use. I wouldn't generically say that the value of BCA is hurt by those considerations. But what I would say is it's difficult. I think you all know it's difficult. It requires more effort than a least cost exploration. And so right off the bat, you know, you'll want to consider whether all the effort that goes into it is likely or unlikely to change your decision. And you might not know until you do it, but sometimes you probably do know. For example, if the legislature has told P&M you have to do something, then you know at the end of the day you're going to do it, and doing a benefit cost analysis might not be as helpful as just finding the least cost way to do what you've been mandated to do. But again, the distinction there is if there's two different ways to meet that mandate, and you think one of them that is not least cost could unleash the potential for a whole different suite of benefits, that's when you might do it. That's when you might do the BCA. And so, of course, there's that trade-off between the level of effort and whether it will change the decision, but also whether putting in that effort is worth it. You know, if you think there's a very small difference in the benefits, it might not be worth it to put in all the effort to evaluate two different proposals that both meet a need.
Right.
Probably
Okay.
a little vague, but that's the best I can do, Brian.
So we're going to continue the discussion, but in a little different format. So Deborah, if you want to show the next couple slides. So we always start out our webinars with objectives of what we're trying to achieve. And then and these are to actually evaluate what's happening in whatever issue we're dealing with, and then to gather inputs and opinions from you all. So today it's obviously about evaluation methodology. Deborah, next slide, please. We use a process that we call GRID. We're asking for grounding, reflecting, interpretive, and then decisional, so we can come to kind of agreement about, well, what did we hear that's in common and might be able to agree upon. Matthew, I'm going to hold your question until we get a little further on. But Debbie, you can go ahead and take that screen off. Thanks very much. So the first is grounding. Like, what did you hear in John's presentation? What stood out to you? And if you'd like, I'd love you to unmute yourself, raise your hand, come off video so we can know that you have a comment that you wanted to make. So what did you hear? What stood out to you? Can I call on some of the utilities, either Curtis or Kyle or Mike or Brian? Any comments about what stood out to you?
Well, I'll kind of reiterate what was in my question, just the sheer complexity of the question of benefit cost analysis for something as big as grid mod is a very challenging issue. And that, I think, it seems to be one that is definitely a concern for folks in this space here, because a lot of the questions kind of stemmed from that same issue.
Great, thank you, Brian. Matthew?
Yeah, and I think this is to kind of go off of what Brian had noted there. This gets down to what are the policy goals, because the policy goals then determine what exactly you're looking at in those inputs. And so getting that clear direction and also understanding that there's a link between those inputs in your policy goal, I think is absolutely paramount. And having a clearer definition of what those are, instead of having it be something that's amorphous, would be very helpful in any rule that came out, because otherwise you're just setting yourself up, I think, for litigation and potentially having to just rely on past decisions and divining what works in what situation. And I think just having some clarity is very important.
Thank you, Matthew. Jim, did you have a comment?
Yes, I did. Sorry, it took me a while to unmute myself there.
No worries.
Yeah, I just found it very interesting, and that I think it was in the beginning of the presentation, the slide that says benefits and costs look different from different perspectives. So, just the recognition of that, and then just to kind of take it a step further is, how do we bridge that gap so we can kind of get more aligned? So that was, for me, a very important point.
Okay, John, do you have any response to that? It's not necessary, just asking.
I didn't feel like I was hearing a question. Was I hearing a question?
No, okay, that's fine. Let me move on. Jim?
Yeah, well, actually, I guess it is a question at the end, is how do we bridge that gap? So in other words, we have different stakeholders having different perspectives and looking at the same set of information and having different perspectives. How do we bridge that? How do we get together? How do we come together?
Yeah, sorry, Jim, I didn't understand the question. This is where I like the approach that is suggested in the NSPM, where each of those perspectives, each of the cost tests reflects a perspective, and the NSPM is recommending that jurisdictions develop their own cost test. And they offer a step-by-step process for doing that. But basically, it's a way to bring the different stakeholders together and say, and reach agreement on what should be considered, which costs should be considered, which benefits should be considered. And it's developing a unique jurisdiction-specific perspective to deciding what's cost effective.
Great, thanks, John. Mike?
Yeah, hello, everybody. Mike D'Antonio with Excel Energy. Yeah, what I got out of the presentation, very good presentation, by the way, John, is that we need to really maintain flexibility on what methodologies we use. And it's probably good to use both least cost and the benefit cost for most everything, just so we have a basis of comparison. One comment I wanted to make is that New Mexico, very poor population, and so least cost a lot of times is an important aspect to maintain for New Mexico. That's basically what I want to say.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Tayoko?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, the benefit cost is perhaps another way of starting to recognize that that we haven't accounted for all the costs in the first place because we don't have a carbon tax, and we probably don't recognize the real costs of what maybe the embodied energy and the things that we do. And so maybe the benefits are trying to bridge the gap here in the short term because there isn't a carbon tax, and that doesn't look like something that's going to happen in the near term. And so we've got to find another way to quantify the real costs of what we're doing here. So I think that's how I see this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tayoko. So we've already kind of moved into some of the reflective responses, which is what surprised you, confused you, or intrigued you. But are there other things that really surprised you, or just that you didn't expect, or brought on some new thinking? And we don't want to hear from just the utilities, so anybody else is welcome to make a comment. Samantha?
Hi there. I'll jump in. So something that stood out to me, or maybe I'm getting into the interpretive here, was the example from Oregon. It definitely is something I'll take away from this presentation, and that takeaway being that some investments may not be cost effective according to your chosen methodology by themselves, but the programs that they enable are cost effective. So I think that was the example where it showed the electric vehicle program by itself and then the demand response program enabled by it. So to me, that suggests that it'll be important going forward to define enabling technology. And I think others have already gotten into this in some of their questions. And also to the extent practicable, evaluating any investments as part of a portfolio. I think that was kind of the takeaway from that example.
Excellent. So we can slide into the interpretive part, which is what insights have you had, or what does this all mean for us in New Mexico? Any of the PRC staff want to comment? Does anybody want to comment on what it means for us versus what we've been doing so far?
I can go ahead. I'd like to jump in on that. And I think this is sort of what stood out. One of the items that stood out to me was the UCT versus the other methodologies. And that gets back to the idea of aligning what you utilize to measure whether or not something goes through with what your intended policy goals are. And so, I think what needs to be looked at in New Mexico is, okay, at what point does a particular program fall under grid mod, or does it fall under CCN? Where does it fall, and then what standard do you apply? And I think having that clear delineation is very important, because it's not going to be a one size fits all. Not only just from the example that was provided in the presentation of every system's different, which is very true, and you've heard from each of the utilities here about that fact, but also the purpose behind each filing is going to be different. So a least cost may make the most sense for CCN purposes, right? But if you're wanting to incorporate other benefits, whether they be environmental or whatever else, that you get that in the right bucket and apply that standard there and make sure that the delineation is clear. And I think getting guidance from the legislature is the safest and best route to ensure some of that, especially considering EE programs, because EE programs and DER share a lot of similarity there. And so is the idea maybe looking back at EE and shifting what EE is really trying to do, and does EE shift over to being a anti-carbon thing, and maybe that's what the standards are, and so you shift it to that. So that's just sort of, I think there's a lot of policy discussions that need to be had, both at the commission level and I think very importantly at the legislative level. Sorry for rambling, I apologize.
That's okay. Thank you, Matthew. Let's go to Art.
Thank you. I want to pick up on both. Matthew's correct, is that we have to be clear about things, but the underlying legislation that we have, he had previously raised a question about the alignment between the statute and the regulations. And the act that we're working under, 233, does not use the term cost effective, right? It gives a lot of considerations as to what kind of projects might be considered grid modernization and what they would be intended to do, and never sets forth a test. So I'm gonna suggest that in like a month from now, I am going to be making a presentation in this forum on approaches to a rulemaking that try to suss out how the commission may evaluate these types of projects. And I'm taking in all the advice that John's given in the conversation we're having now, but also how the utilities ought to think about packaging their applications to the commission. And basically all I'll say is that if the legislature wasn't specific as to how the commission should evaluate these things, then the commission should have pretty wide latitude, but we're not going to be arbitrary, right? We are really going to try and work with the stakeholders to formulate a workable system. So I'll ask everybody's assistance and understanding as we go through this process. But you know, since the legislature didn't limit us, I'm going to suggest that we can do this together. Thank you.
Great. And I love how you guys have gotten this process. We've slidden into decisional, which I love. So let's go to Margie and then we'll go to Ron.
Yeah, thank you, John. Great presentation. I'm curious whether Jacqueline Waite from MNerd or Brian Johnson from Rita had some observations about John's presentation or thoughts that they had about this whole topic. I think they're extremely important stakeholders in this process as well, and maybe Jacqueline or Brian would want to offer their comments.
And let's do this. Let's give them, let me go to Ron and get his question and give them a minute to think about it to see if they want to respond. So Ron.
Yes, thank you. Again, great presentation by John. Really appreciate it. A couple of things that I was struck with was the comment that was made about how we are a poor state, and so least cost needs to be important. And I thought that missed the point. It certainly goes to the other point that was made, I think Tayoko made, about how we have to get other things involved besides cost, whether that's carbon reduction or something else. But for me, the thing that was most interesting about the cost benefit analysis is the one slide I think that showed that if you were to involve the utilities in having a program, it might reduce T&D costs. And so in looking at the least cost program, for example, in either EVs or distributed energy resources, if you just look at it as a least cost analysis, you might say, well, gee, you've got the same T&D cost, you got the same costs now, where additional costs that we're going to add, well, that's not the cheapest, and that's not good for our community. But I think looking at this, unfortunately, in our particular case in New Mexico, where the utilities are essentially getting an incentive through the amount of investment they make, they sort of lean on the side of, okay, if we have to do it, then let's do the least cost. But if in fact it's the least cost for everyone, not just the utility, but for the customers, and so the benefit cost analysis shows that by putting in place a program that will reduce those costs to the customer, that should be the program that gets approved. But it might not be in the utility's interest to do it if it's going to reduce the amount of investment they make. So we need to find a way to make that happen in the cost benefit analysis, as well as incentivizing the utilities to feel comfortable in doing that. At least that's my view.
Thanks very much, Ron. So Jackie, back to you, or some of the staff in New Mexico that's worked through a lot of these issues.
Let's see. It looks like my camera's not working. There we go. Gosh, I've appreciated the conversation, of course. I appreciate us coming back to some of the things that we presented originally in our webinar, and I think this has been a really great presentation. MNerd, of course, is working on implementing the statutes that already exist. And I was thinking about Matthew's comments about policy and, appreciating the fact that some more clarity from the legislature might be necessary. And I don't envy what the commission has to do to put together this NOPR and the rule. So, part of me is, in a listening mode for a reason, because I think that the stakeholders that are here that are contributing, certainly those voices are, all your voices are important. One thing that did come up that I would like a little bit more information on, and I can certainly follow up following the links, but the idea of a social cost test that's come up in some of my research before. I think it's maybe Arizona that has worked on that for demand response. I could be wrong. But because EMNERD represents all of the state, all of the entities, all of the customers in a way, we have that broader picture. I'm interested in what that kind of test looks like, and how it's being defined. I know that's a little bit off topic maybe from what we've been talking about, but.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. No, I think it's directly on topic, because one of the things we want to look at in the decisional is what do we agree upon, what needs additional work, and what steps. And so you're bringing forward that we should look at societal cost tests or get more information. What else needs work, folks? What else needs more additional information, or what steps should be taken next?
Hello, everybody. Amanda and
Right.
Margie, thanks for the invitation to comment. And I'd just like to briefly say I invite everyone on this call to look at our transmission study of 2020 and also the update of 2022, where we do have some economic analysis to digest. But otherwise, on this topic of cost tests and the BCA, I definitely would like to look at the report that is the basis for this meeting today before giving any more detailed comments on behalf of Rita. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, what else do we need? We heard that Art's going to inform us next workshop. That is the next workshop, to talk about how the commission may evaluate all grid investments. What else do you need to throw up to make sure that Art is considering, and you all, as we try to move towards a NOPR? Sydney?
You noticed that I turned my camera on.
Yes, I did.
So, I haven't attended all your webinars, and I'm happy that they're available online because they've been super informative. I had the notoriety of being on the staff team that opposed one of New Mexico's major utilities' previous AMI applications because, we felt like just savings because jobs were cut is not a huge benefit. We wanted to see all the functionality that AMI enables. And one of the things that I struggled with then, and I'm also struggling with now as our utilities are now re-upping their proposals under the Grid Mod Act, is like the particular hardware and software specifications that we should be looking for, because we want whatever the utilities invest in to be forward-looking and be able to accommodate what we see on the horizon. So, but on the other hand, we don't necessarily want to encourage, unnecessary, quote, gold plating, to sound like an old regulator. So I guess, so vendor, like hardware and software specifications would be important. Like, what are the basic ones that we really need to be looking for in these proposals?
Thanks, Sydney. And I want to point out that John put in the chat that the NSPM explains how each cost test works in detail for Jackie's question.
And I'd just like to jump into Sydney's comment there, and hearing that, I think we do have the ability to maybe follow models from what has been done in other venues, right? You have the and I could definitely see this with DER, and that's why the DER and an EE very much are have a lot of the similar flavor. It's just about determining what your goal is, and that's where something like a TPM, right, comes in handy. Or TR, the technical reference manuals, right, that have the approved programs, tell you what's acceptable out there, and I think that may be an approach that makes sense, right? Because at that point in time, you have input from everybody else. It's proven, and it's not just a tech bro driven, hey, I'm throwing this out there. It's actually analyzed, scrutinized to determine, the holy trinity in my mind, which is always you look at cost, you look at reliability, and then you look at environment and other factors.
Thanks, Matthew. Jim.
Yeah, thank you very much. So first of all, I want to say that on behalf of RIA, we look forward to the NOPR, and we look forward to participating on that and this really important topic. We've heard a lot of really good presentations so far, and there's been a lot of information provided, especially today, a lot of good places to look for more information. But I did hear a couple references to possibly more legislation on this particular topic. And, at the risk of stating the obvious, the legislature doesn't meet until next January, February. So I don't really think that we should wait on something like that. I think this is a topic that should be addressed as soon as possible and in this NOPR. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Any observations or pieces of information we still need, or things we need to work on related to evaluation? Okay, Deborah, if you want to put up slides or go to our survey. Thanks, everybody. Great participation again. John, super presentation. Really appreciate the clarity and all the reference materials. So we, as I said on the very top, let's go ahead and do the poll. And what we're asking is, how did we meet our objectives for today's meeting of being able to present information and be able to get information back? Okay, let's end and post the poll. And then it's interesting, we always typically have one person that said we did not meet our objectives. And so if that's you and you ever feel like sharing with us what we could do better, always would really appreciate that, because hard to know what to do better unless we get some criticism or thoughts back. Okay, Deborah, you can take that down. So we are coming to the end of our webinar series, which was intended to collect information to help the PRC develop a NOPR on grid modernization. As I mentioned at the very top, the 16th was our next webinar, where we were scheduled to have presentations, a presentation about best practices from other states. We determined that we thought that that's actually been covered by all of our presenters, and that we have sufficient information of best practices. So we are going to cancel the 16th. We were going to have 3 webinars in June, so now we're down to 2. And our next one is going to be on June 30th, and that will be our presenter will be Art, and he's going to be presenting what he is envisioning of how this NOPR will come together. So you all have been very consistent in your participation, and we hope that you'll be available for that one as well. And then we're going to provide almost a month's time and present our last wrap up on July 21st, where we're going to try to present the findings and recommendations of going forward. So again, really appreciate you participating today. Anybody have any last comments or thoughts? Okay, John, thanks again. Really appreciate your time and expertise. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, good job, but I need to leave.
Okay,
I'll
bye,
talk
Art.
to you.
Yep.
Amanda, did you see my chat?
I did. And Vice Chair Hall, we can consider that. We're going to need to talk to staff about that.
Okay. I mean, I know you know why I'm asking.
Yeah.
Just to,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, let me get back to you, and we're going to try to get on a call here sometime soon, you and I. So hopefully we can schedule that and we could talk about that then.
Yeah, I'd like that. Thanks a lot.
I sent you times in an email, I think yesterday.
Oh, good. I haven't seen it. I'll look.
Okay. And then I think we're going to excuse everybody except for the GridWorks staff.
Okay. I'm getting off.
That's okay. Thank you so much.
Just wanted to communicate that with you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Couple more are logging off.
And Deb, I think you have the ability to end the recording.
Yes, and Miguel was going to do that too. Oh, I cannot end the recording. I just texted him to stop.
Terrific, thanks.
Thank you. And I'm just waiting for a few people to drop off.
See,
I think we have.
I just jettisoned my first person. I've never done that before. The power.
Yeah, I think there's a couple more waiting to be dumped.
I think we're good now.
Yeah, I think we got rid of everybody.
Yeah.
We are still recording. I'd wait till that ends so that that doesn't get posted live.
Thank you, Margie. Very smart.
Okay, guys, I'm here.
Deb, maybe we want to just end this and then jump on another link.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm usually at the top.
It's fine.
No problem. I'll just end it, and then Margie and Amanda, I'll link you in 2 minutes. Okay.
And Miguel, thank you so much for stepping up today. Really, really